On the morning of March 19, 1946, a dusty convoy of military trucks rolled through the sun-baked plains of West Texas, carrying cargo more unusual than ammunition or supplies. Inside sat 23 Japanese women, former prisoners of war who had survived the brutality of internment camps in the Philippines, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty as they traveled toward a temporary processing facility near the small ranching town of Crystal City. These women, mostly civilian nurses and teachers caught in the chaos of the Pacific War, had endured years of starvation, disease, and the constant shadow of death. Now, in the strange landscape of their former enemy's homeland, they prepared themselves for more hostility, more contempt, more reasons to believe that humanity had abandoned them entirely. The convoy stopped unexpectedly at a dusty crossroads where a cattle drive had blocked the narrow road. Steam rose from the backs of several hundred head of longhorn cattle as they milled about, their horns catching the late afternoon sun. 3 cowboys sat astride their horses, working to redirect the herd. The lead cowboy, a weathered man named Samuel Sam Hutchins, raised his hand in apology to the military driver. According to records maintained by the Texas Historical Commission, this chance encounter would become one of the most remarkable footnotes in the complex story of post-war reconciliation. The military escort commander, Lieutenant Robert Morrison, stepped out to assess the delay. The Japanese women peered through the canvas flaps of the truck, their eyes wide with curiosity and apprehension. They had been taught that Americans were barbarous monsters who would show them no mercy. Yet here, in this moment of unexpected pause, something entirely different unfolded. Sam Hutchins dismounted and walked toward Lieutenant Morrison, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The 2 men spoke briefly, the cowboy gesturing toward the herd and explaining the situation. Then something remarkable happened. Sam looked past the lieutenant toward the trucks, catching glimpses of the pale, frightened faces watching from within. He removed his Stetson hat, wiped his brow, and said something to Morrison that would change the tenor of that dusty afternoon. Within minutes, 2 other cowboys joined them. Bros Thomas and William Garrett had been working the Hutchins Ranch for nearly a decade, and they carried the same code of Western hospitality that their fathers and grandfathers had practiced before them. In the post-war Texas landscape, where Japanese Americans had faced discrimination and hostility, these men saw something different in the eyes of the exhausted women. They saw human beings who needed kindness. Lieutenant Morrison returned to the trucks and, to the astonishment of his fellow soldiers and the Japanese women, announced that during the delay, anyone who wished could stretch their legs. More surprisingly, the cowboys had offered to let some of the women sit on their horses while they waited. The women looked at each other in disbelief, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, fear, and something they had not felt in years, a glimmer of hope that perhaps not all Americans fit the propaganda they had been fed. The first woman to step down from the truck was Kimiko Yamamoto, a 32-year-old former schoolteacher from Osaka who had been teaching at a Japanese school in Manila when the war began. Her legs trembled as her feet touched Texas soil, partly from the long journey and partly from uncertainty about what would happen next. She had watched her friends die in the camps, had witnessed cruelty that defied description, and had learned to expect the worst from humanity. Yet here stood Sam Hutchins, his hat in his hands, speaking slowly and gesturing toward his chestnut mare with a gentle smile that seemed to transcend language barriers entirely. Through a young Nisei translator who had joined the convoy at the last processing station, Sam explained that the horses were gentle and that the women were welcome to sit in the saddles while they rested. He demonstrated by patting his mare's neck, showing how calm and patient the animal was. The horse, sensing the nervous energy of the strangers, stood perfectly still, her ears forward with curiosity but her demeanor peaceful. Kimiko glanced back at her companions, who watched from the truck with expressions ranging from terror to cautious interest. Another woman, Sachiko Tanaka, a 28-year-old nurse who had cared for wounded soldiers and civilians during the brutal Battle of Manila, slowly emerged from the truck. Her hands bore scars from untreated infections she had contracted while working with minimal supplies. She approached the horse with hesitant steps, and Sam extended his weathered hand to help her. The moment Sachiko touched the horse's warm flank, something shifted in her expression. The animal's gentle breathing, the soft texture of its coat, the simple reality of this peaceful creature, created a stark contrast to the violence and deprivation she had known. Sam helped her into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups and speaking softly in English words she could not understand but whose tone conveyed reassurance and respect. For the first time in 4 years, Sachiko felt tears that were not born of pain or grief. William Garrett brought his gray gelding closer, and soon another woman, Haruko Nakamura, a 45-year-old widow who had lost her husband and 2 sons during the war, found herself sitting atop the gentle giant. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her body rigid with fear, but William walked slowly beside the horse, his hand on the reins, speaking in a low, calm voice. He told her about the horse, about the ranch, about the endless Texas sky, even though he knew she understood nothing of his words. What mattered was not the language but the humanity in the exchange. One by one, more women emerged from the trucks. The American soldiers watched in stunned silence as this impromptu gathering, transformed the dusty crossroads into an unexpected bridge between former enemies. Thomas Garrett retrieved his harmonica from his saddlebag and began playing a soft, melancholy tune that seemed to belong to no particular nation but to the universal language of longing and hope. The cattle settled, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and for a brief moment, the war seemed like a distant nightmare rather than the defining reality of their recent existence. As more women gained confidence, the crossroads transformed into something resembling a small festival, though one tinged with the solemnity of recent suffering. Yuriko Sato, a 24-year-old who had been studying literature at Manila University when the Japanese occupation began, found herself seated on Sam Hutchins' mare, her fingers gently stroking the horse's mane. Through the translator, she asked tentative questions about the animal, about ranching, about Texas itself. Sam answered with patience, describing the vast ranches that stretched across the landscape, the tradition of cattle drives that had shaped the region, and the code of the West that valued hospitality and straight dealing above most else. The translator, a young man named James Takahashi, whose parents had been interned at the Roa War Relocation Center in Arkansas, worked tirelessly to facilitate these exchanges. He had volunteered for this duty partly out of a desire to help his ancestral people and partly out of a deep belief that understanding could prevent future conflicts. As he translated Sam's descriptions of ranch life, James noticed something remarkable. The Japanese women were not just listening politely but were genuinely engaged, asking follow-up questions, sharing small smiles, and beginning to relax their defensive postures. Lieutenant Morrison, initially skeptical of this unscheduled stop, found himself moved by what he witnessed. He had fought in the Pacific Theater, had seen friends die on islands with names he could barely pronounce, and had carried his own burden of hatred toward the Japanese. Yet watching these emaciated women, some showing visible signs of torture and neglect, experiencing simple kindness from Texas cowboys, challenged his carefully constructed narratives about enemies and justice. He pulled out a canteen and offered water to several women, an action that would have been unthinkable to him just weeks earlier. Michiko Hayashi, a 36-year-old artist who had documented life in the internment camps through secret sketches hidden in her clothing, sat on Thomas Garrett's horse and looked across the Texas landscape with an artist's eye. The play of light on the distant mesas, the way that dust caught the amber rays of the descending sun, the contrast between the harsh environment and the unexpected gentleness she had encountered here created a cognitive dissonance that would take years to fully process. She had drawn images of cruelty and death for so long that she had nearly forgotten how to capture moments of beauty and compassion. Through James, Thomas asked Michiko about Japan, about her life before the war, about her hopes for the future. These questions, so simple and yet so profound, reminded her that she was more than a prisoner, more than a survivor, more than a representative of a defeated nation. She was a human being with a history, dreams, and a story worth telling. As she answered, describing the cherry blossoms of Kyoto where she had grown up, her voice grew stronger, and the other women listened, remembering their own homes, their own losses, their own reasons to continue living. That cattle had mostly cleared the road, but no one seemed eager to resume the journey. The soldiers stood in small clusters, smoking cigarettes and watching this unexpected scene with expressions of confusion and contemplation. The cowboys moved among the women with the same casual respect they would show any guests on their land, offering water from canteens, demonstrating how to properly hold the reins, and sharing the universal language of laughter when one particularly spirited horse tried to nibble on a woman's sleeve. As the golden hour approached and shadows lengthened across the prairie, Sam Hutchins sat on a fallen log near one of the trucks, his hat pushed back on his head, speaking with Lieutenant Morrison about the unexpected turn their afternoon had taken. Morrison explained that these women were among the last groups of Japanese POWs being processed through Texas facilities before eventual repatriation. Many had lost everything, families destroyed, homes obliterated by the firebombing campaigns that had ravaged Japanese cities. Some feared returning to a homeland that existed only in memory, to a Japan that had been fundamentally transformed by defeat and occupation. Sam listened thoughtfully, occasionally glancing toward the women who were now gathered in small groups, some still near the horses, others sitting on the ground sharing what appeared to be rations from the military supplies. He spoke about his own experiences in the First World War, about the French villages he had seen destroyed, about the young German soldiers he had captured who looked no different from the boys he had grown up with in Texas. War, he reflected, turned everyone into something less than human, but peace required them to become human again, and that transformation was often the hardest battle of all. Fumiko Ishikawa, a 51-year-old woman who had been a respected physician in Manila before the war, approached Lieutenant Morrison with the translator's help. She wanted to thank him for allowing this stop, for permitting this brief respite from their journey into uncertainty. As she spoke, Morrison noticed the dignity with which she carried herself despite her threadbare clothing and malnourished frame. She had maintained her medical knowledge throughout captivity, treating fellow prisoners with whatever improvised materials she could find, saving lives with nothing but skill and determination. Through James, Fumiko asked Morrison about the American medical facilities, about whether she might be able to practice medicine again someday, somewhere. Morrison found himself promising to make inquiries, to write letters on her behalf, actions that surprised him even as he spoke them. The war had taught him to hate, but this encounter was teaching him something different. Something about the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of redemption, not just for individuals but for nations. William Garrett had given his horse over to a young woman named Akiko Suzuki, barely 19 years old, who had been forced into service as a translator for the Japanese military government in Manila. She had witnessed atrocities committed by her own countrymen that haunted her dreams, and she carried a burden of guilt for surviving when so many others had not. As she sat in the saddle, William walked beside the horse, and through a combination of gestures and simple words that James translated when nearby, he told her about second chances, about how the West was built by people running from their pasts, seeking redemption in hard work and honest living. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature began to drop, bringing relief from the day's heat. Sam finally stood and approached Morrison, suggesting that they should probably let the convoy continue its journey before darkness fell completely. Morrison nodded, calling to his men to prepare for departure. The women began slowly returning to the trucks, their movements reluctant, as if leaving this strange oasis of kindness meant returning to a harsher reality. Before Kimiko Yamamoto climbed back into the truck, she approached Sam with something in her hand. It was a small origami crane, folded from a piece of paper she had carried throughout her captivity. Through James, she explained that in Japanese tradition, the crane represented hope and peace, and she wanted Sam to have it as thanks for his kindness. Sam accepted the delicate paper bird with reverence, promising to keep it safe. A promise he would maintain for the rest of his life. The convoy resumed its journey as twilight descended upon the Texas plains, but the women in the trucks carried with them something they had not possessed hours earlier, a complicated, fragile sense that perhaps the world contained more nuance than propaganda had suggested. Sachiko Tanaka sat with her back against the truck's wooden slat, her muscles still remembering the gentle sway of the horse beneath her, her mind struggling to reconcile years of conditioning about American barbarism with the genuine kindness she had just experienced. In the lead vehicle, Lieutenant Morrison found himself composing a letter in his mind to his wife back in Pennsylvania, trying to find words to describe what he had witnessed. He had written her dozens of letters during the war, filled with carefully censored descriptions of combat and vague reassurances about his safety. But this letter would be different, more personal, more revealing of the internal transformation he was experiencing. How could he explain that 23 Japanese women and 3 Texas cowboys had fundamentally altered his understanding of humanity's capacity for reconciliation? The Hutchins Ranch house came into view as the cowboys drove the cattle home. The main house was a sprawling structure that had housed 3 generations of the family, its wooden frame weathered by decades of West Texas sun and wind. Sam's wife, Margaret, stood on the porch waiting, and even from a distance, she could tell something significant had occurred. After 41 years of marriage, she had learned to read her husband's expressions, to recognize the contemplative silence that meant he was processing something profound. Over dinner that evening, Sam recounted the afternoon's events to Margaret and their adult daughter, Elizabeth, who had returned to the ranch after her own service as an army nurse in Europe. Elizabeth listened with particular interest, having witnessed her own moments of unexpected humanity amid the carnage of war. She had treated wounded German prisoners in field hospitals behind the advancing Allied lines, had seen enemy soldiers cry for their mothers, had recognized that suffering transcended national boundaries. Margaret pulled out her journal that night, a leather-bound volume where she had recorded the significant events of their life on the ranch. In careful script, she documented the date, March 19, 1946, and Sam's encounter with the Japanese women. She included details about the origami crane, now displayed carefully on the mantelpiece, and her husband's reflection that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with simple acts of recognition that saw past uniforms and nationalities to the shared humanity beneath. Meanwhile, at the processing facility in Crystal City, the Japanese women were led into barracks that, while stark and institutional, were far superior to the conditions they had endured in the Philippine camps. Hot water was available for bathing, clean clothing was distributed, and medical personnel began preliminary health assessments. But the conversations that night, whispered in the darkness between bunks, focused less on these material improvements and more on the strange encounter at the crossroads. Yuriko Sato, lying awake on her cot, found herself thinking about Sam Hutchins' weathered face and kind eyes, about the way he had treated her horse with such obvious affection, about the patience he had shown in trying to communicate despite the language barrier. She thought about the literature she had studied before the war, the Western novels she had read that portrayed cowboys as violent, lawless men. The reality had been so different, and this disparity troubled her comfortable categories of understanding. Fumiko Ishikawa, the physician, sat on the edge of her bunk, writing notes in a small journal she had managed to preserve throughout her captivity. She documented the physical and emotional states of her fellow prisoners, noting that the brief encounter with the cowboys had produced a measurable improvement in morale. Several women who had been withdrawn and unresponsive for weeks had engaged in animated conversation that evening, processing their confusion about Americans who showed them kindness rather than contempt. The following morning, April 20th, 1946, brought cold rain to West Texas, unusual for the season but welcome to ranchers who had endured a dry winter. At the Hutchins Ranch, Sam stood on the porch with his coffee, watching water stream from the roof and thinking about the women he had met. Margaret joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, and they discussed a decision that had been forming in Sam's mind since the previous afternoon. He wanted to write a letter to the processing facility, offering to host some of the women at the ranch for short visits before their repatriation. Margaret was not surprised by this suggestion, knowing her husband's character, but she raised practical concerns. How would the community react? How would they manage the language barrier? What if the government officials disapproved? Sam listened to each concern with the same patient attention he had shown the previous day, then quietly observed that if they lived their lives worried about what others thought, they would never accomplish anything worthwhile. Elizabeth enthusiastically supported her father's plan, volunteering to help coordinate the visits and serve as a liaison with the military authorities. Her nursing experience had taught her the therapeutic value of normalcy, of allowing traumatized individuals to experience ordinary life routines that reminded them of their humanity. She suggested they could involve other ranch families, create a network of temporary hosts who would offer these women a glimpse of civilian American life before they returned to Japan. At the Crystal City facility, the Japanese women underwent extensive medical examinations and interviews with military intelligence officers who needed to verify their identities and circumstances. Many struggled with this process, exhausted by years of interrogation and suspicious of any official questioning. Kimiko Yamamoto, answering questions about her time in Manila, found herself suddenly weeping, overwhelmed by memories of students she had taught who had died in the bombing raids, of the schools that had become makeshift hospitals, of the collapse of everything she had built her life around. The facility's administrator, Colonel James Henderson, was a career military officer who had initially viewed his assignment overseeing Japanese POW processing as a routine bureaucratic task. However, he was beginning to recognize the complexity of his responsibility. These were not hardened soldiers but civilians caught in war's machinery, women who had endured unspeakable hardships and now faced an uncertain future. When Lieutenant Morrison filed his report about the encounter with the Texas cowboys, Henderson read it with growing interest. By the end of the week, Sam's letter arrived at Henderson's desk. Written in simple, direct language, it proposed a program of brief ranch visits for the Japanese women, allowing them to experience American hospitality before repatriation. Sam acknowledged the potential complications but argued that such gestures might plant seeds of understanding that could bear fruit in future relations between their nations. He included character references from local officials and offered to work within whatever guidelines the military deemed appropriate. Henderson sat with the letter for several days, consulting with superiors and considering the precedents such a program might establish. The war had ended months earlier, but hatred and suspicion still ran deep on both sides. Yet something in Sam's straightforward proposal appealed to Henderson's sense that peace required more than treaties and occupation. It required human connections, bridges built between former enemies at the most fundamental level. On April 30th, 1946, Henderson approved a pilot program allowing selected Japanese women to spend supervised day visits at the Hutchins Ranch and potentially other nearby ranches that volunteered. The approval came with extensive conditions. Military escorts would accompany the women. Visits would be limited to daylight hours, no more than 5 women at a time, and the program would be immediately suspended if any security concerns arose. Henderson added a personal note to his official memo, expressing hope that this small experiment in reconciliation might serve a larger purpose. On the morning of May 7, 1946, a military jeep arrived at the Hutchins Ranch carrying 4 Japanese women and a young military escort. Corporal David Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese. The women who emerged from the vehicle were the same ones who had sat on the cowboys' horses 3 weeks earlier. Kimiko Yamamoto, Sachiko Tanaka, Yuriko Sato, and Michiko Hayashi. They approached the ranch house with visible nervousness, uncertain what to expect from this unprecedented invitation. Margaret Hutchins stood on the porch in her best dress, her gray hair pinned neatly, her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that conveyed both welcome and her own nervousness about this encounter. Elizabeth stood beside her mother, smiling warmly and gesturing for the women to come inside. The ranch house interior was modest but comfortable, filled with photographs spanning generations, handmade quilts draped over furniture, and the aroma of fresh bread and coffee that transcended cultural boundaries. Through Corporal Chen's translation, Margaret explained that she had prepared lunch and hoped the women would feel comfortable in their home. She showed them the living room where they could sit, offered them coffee or water, and then did something remarkable. She brought out photo albums documenting the Hutchins family history. As the women gathered around, Margaret narrated stories of the ranch's founding, of Sam's grandfather who had driven cattle north to Kansas in the 1870s, of droughts and floods survived, of children raised and lost. Michiko, the artist, asked if she might sketch the house and the family photographs. Margaret enthusiastically agreed, providing paper and pencils. As Michiko's skilled hands captured the ranch house's interior on paper, the other women began to relax, asking questions about the photographs, about Margaret's children, about ranch life. These conversations, though filtered through Corporal Chen's translations, began to reveal the universal experiences that connected their different worlds: hopes for children, grief over losses, pride in work well done, and love for home. Sam and his ranch hands spent the morning working with cattle in a nearby pen, and after lunch he invited the women to observe the work. Kimiko, who had been a teacher, showed particular interest in the ranching operations, asking detailed questions about breeding, feeding, and the economics of cattle production. Sam explained with the same patience he had shown at their first meeting, occasionally pausing to demonstrate techniques or allow the women to touch the animals under careful supervision. Sachiko, the nurse, noticed an injured calf in one of the pens and immediately approached it with professional concern. Through gestures and Corporal Chen's translation, she communicated with Sam about the animal's condition. Together, they examined the injury, and Sachiko suggested a treatment approach based on her medical knowledge. Sam was impressed by her expertise and implemented her recommendations, an act of respect that acknowledged her professional identity rather than seeing her only as a former prisoner. As the afternoon progressed, Elizabeth brought out her guitar and played several American folk songs, including Home on the Range and Red River Valley. The melodies seemed to touch something universal in the gathering, and soon Yuriko shyly offered to sing a Japanese folk song her mother had taught her as a child. Her clear voice carried across the ranch yard, singing of mountains and rivers in her distant homeland, and when she finished, there was a moment of profound silence as everyone recognized they had witnessed something sacred, the sharing of culture not as propaganda or politics but as a gift between human beings. Before the women returned to the facility that evening, Margaret presented each with a small package containing homemade cookies, a practice she had maintained whenever guests left their home. The simple gesture, so ordinary in its execution, carried enormous symbolic weight. These packages acknowledged the women as guests worthy of hospitality rather than enemies deserving only suspicion. As the jeep pulled away from the ranch, the four women waved until the house disappeared from view, each carrying not just cookies but a seed of hope that peace might actually be possible. Throughout May and into early June of 1946, the ranch visit program expanded beyond the Hutchins property. The Peterson family, who spread bordered the Hutchins land, volunteered to host Japanese women, followed by the Rodriguez Ranch, whose Mexican-American owners understood something about being viewed with suspicion by mainstream society despite being United States citizens for generations. Each visit followed similar patterns: initial nervousness giving way to tentative conversation, shared meals creating opportunities for connection, and work demonstrations building respect across cultural divides. Maria Rodriguez proved particularly effective at connecting with the Japanese women, perhaps because her own grandmother had immigrated from Mexico facing discrimination and hardship. Through Corporal Chen's translation, Maria shared stories of her family's struggles and triumphs, creating parallels that the Japanese women recognized from their own experiences. She taught several of them traditional Mexican recipes, and in exchange, they taught her how to fold origami, creating tangible artifacts of cultural exchange that would be preserved for decades. The local newspaper, the Crystal City Clarion, learned of the program in late May. Editor Frank Thompson faced a difficult decision about whether to publish a story that might provoke controversy in a community where anti-Japanese sentiment remained strong. However, after interviewing Sam Hutchins and Colonel Henderson, and after much deliberation, Thompson decided that the story of reconciliation was more important than avoiding difficult conversations. His article, published on June 1, 1946, was titled "Texas Hospitality Crosses Pacific Divide" and presented the ranch visits as an example of Christian charity and American values. The response to Thompson's article was mixed. Several readers wrote angry letters condemning the program, arguing that these women deserved no kindness after Pearl Harbor and the brutal treatment of American prisoners in Japanese camps. These letters reflected genuine pain and loss, written by parents who had lost sons in the Pacific, by veterans who carried physical and psychological scars from combat, by Americans who could not yet imagine forgiveness. Thompson published these letters alongside others that supported the program, creating a public dialogue about the difficult work of moving beyond hatred. At the processing facility, Colonel Henderson observed remarkable changes in the women who participated in the ranch visits. Their physical health improved with better nutrition and medical care, but more significantly, their psychological states transformed. Women who had been withdrawn and depressed began engaging with their environment, asking questions about their repatriation process, and making plans for their return to Japan. The simple act of being treated as human beings worthy of respect seemed to restore their sense of agency and hope. Fumiko Ishikawa, the physician, used her medical knowledge to help other women at the facility, effectively becoming an informal medical consultant to the American staff. Colonel Henderson recognized her expertise and arranged for her to receive proper medical supplies and a workspace where she could treat minor ailments among the Japanese women. This trust, this acknowledgement of her professional identity, meant more to Fumiko than any amount of charity could have achieved. She began corresponding with American medical professionals about the possibility of continuing her practice after repatriation. By mid-June, the program had facilitated over 30 individual ranch visits involving 15 different Japanese women and 6 local families. Each visit was documented in military reports that made their way up the chain of command, eventually reaching officers involved in planning the occupation of Japan. Some of these officers recognized that successful occupation would require not just military control but cultural bridge building, and the Texas Ranch program offered a model, however small, for how former enemies might begin to see each other differently. The impact extended beyond the immediate participants. Children on the ranches who met the Japanese women learned lessons there. Textbooks could never provide about the complexity of war and peace, about the difference between nations and individuals, about the hard work of reconciliation. These children would carry these lessons into adulthood, shaping their views on everything from civil rights to international relations, creating ripples that would extend far beyond that particular time and place. As summer arrived in West Texas, bringing oppressive heat and the constant buzz of cicadas, the repatriation schedules began to finalize. The Japanese women would board ships from California ports bound for Yokohama, returning to a homeland many barely recognized from the descriptions they heard from more recently captured prisoners. Japan was occupied, its cities devastated, its people struggling with food shortages and the psychological trauma of defeat. The women faced this return with mixed emotions: relief at leaving captivity, fear about what they would find, and unexpected sadness at leaving behind the connections they had formed in Texas. On July 15, 1946, the Hutchins Ranch hosted a farewell gathering for the women who had participated in the visit program. Nearly 40 people attended, including the 6 host families, military personnel from the processing facility, local clergy, and the Japanese women themselves. It was an unprecedented event. Former enemies gathered together for a meal and conversation that acknowledged both the pain of the past and the tentative hope for a different future. Reverend William Morrison from the local Methodist Church offered a prayer that carefully navigated the complicated emotions present in the gathering. He acknowledged the suffering on all sides, the losses that could never be fully healed, and the courage required to extend and accept gestures of reconciliation. His words reflected the theological struggle many Christians faced in reconciling the commandment to love one's enemies with the very real grief and anger they felt about the war's devastation. Margaret Hutchins had organized a gift exchange, with each host family presenting the Japanese women with small tokens for their journey. The Hutchins gave each woman a photograph of the ranch and a handwritten note expressing hopes for their future well-being. The Peterson family contributed quilted potholders made by Mrs. Peterson's sewing circle, practical items that also represented hours of communal labor and care. The Rodriguez family presented hand-painted decorative tiles, each featuring a different Texas wildflower, symbols of beauty emerging from harsh environments. In return, the Japanese women offered their own gifts, items they had created during their time at the facility. Michiko presented each family with a sketch she had made during the visits, detailed drawings that captured not just the physical appearance of the ranches, but the emotional texture of the encounters. Yuriko had written out Japanese poems, translated into English with Corporal Chen's help, verses about cherry blossoms and homecoming that resonated with the universal longing for peace. The women had collectively created an origami display representing the Thousand Cranes tradition, a labor-intensive project completed over many evenings, symbolizing their prayers for peace. Kimiko Yamamoto stood to speak, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. Through Corporal Chen's translation, she thanked the families for their kindness, acknowledging that she and her companions had arrived in Texas expecting further cruelty and had instead encountered humanity. She spoke of the difficulty of reconciling propaganda with reality, of learning that enemies could become something more complicated once you saw them as individuals rather than representatives of nations. She expressed hope that the small seeds planted during these visits might grow into something larger, contributing to a future where such devastating wars became impossible. Sam Hutchins responded with characteristic brevity, saying simply that they had done nothing more than what any decent person should do, recognize the humanity in others regardless of circumstance. He noted that the West had been built by people from many nations working together, and that Texas itself had been shaped by Spanish, Mexican, Anglo, and many other influences. This heritage of cultural mixing, he suggested, positioned them well to understand that national boundaries were less important than shared human values. As the gathering concluded and the women prepared to return to the processing facility for the final time, there were tears and embraces that transcended language. Elizabeth Hutchins exchanged addresses with several women, promising to write and maintain contact. This promise would prove difficult to keep in the immediate post-war years when communication between Japan and the United States remained complicated, but the attempt itself was significant. representing a commitment to relationship that extended beyond the immediate circumstances. Echoes through time. The Japanese women departed from the processing facility on July 23, 1946, beginning the long journey back to Japan via train to California, and then by ship across the Pacific. Each carried with them not just the physical gifts from the Texas families but memories that would shape their understanding of America and Americans for the rest of their lives. These memories would influence how they spoke about their experiences, how they taught their children and grandchildren about the war, and how they approached the complex work of rebuilding their nation. Kimiko Yamamoto returned to Osaka to find her childhood home destroyed by firebombing, her extended family scattered, and her profession as a teacher initially complicated by the stigma attached to those who had been captured rather than choosing death. However, she eventually found work at a school in a rural area, where she incorporated lessons about international understanding into her curriculum. She spoke to her students about the complexity of nations, about the difference between governments and individuals, and about the Texas cowboys who had shown her kindness when she expected none. These lessons influenced hundreds of students over her 30-year teaching career. Sachiko Tanaka faced particularly difficult challenges upon repatriation. The injuries and illnesses she had contracted during captivity left her unable to practice nursing at the level she had before the war. However, she found work training new nurses and became an advocate for better treatment of POWs and displaced persons. She maintained correspondence with Elizabeth Hutchins for several years, the letters moving slowly through military postal channels and then through regular international mail as communication normalized. These letters discussed not just personal matters but broader questions about how nations heal after devastating conflicts. In Texas, life at the Hutchins Ranch returned to its rhythms of cattle work, seasonal challenges, and family gatherings. However, the experiences of that spring and summer remained a frequent topic of conversation. Sam kept Kimiko's origami crane on the mantelpiece until his death in 1968, and it remained there afterward, a small paper reminder of an extraordinary encounter. Margaret recorded the events in detail in her journal, and these writings would later become a resource for historians studying post-war reconciliation efforts. The ranch visit program, though small in scale, was documented in military reports that circulated among occupation officials. While it would be an overstatement to claim it significantly influenced American policy in occupied Japan, the program did contribute to ongoing discussions about the importance of people-to-people contacts in rebuilding international relationships. Several officers involved in the program went on to careers in diplomacy and international development, carrying with them lessons learned from watching former enemies share meals and conversation on Texas ranches. In Crystal City, the processing facility eventually closed, and the town returned to its primary identity as an agricultural community. However, the brief period when it hosted Japanese POWs became part of local history, complicated and contested but gradually acknowledged. Frank Thompson's articles about the ranch visits were preserved in the newspaper's archives and were rediscovered decades later by researchers studying the aftermath of World War II. Providing primary source documentation of grassroots reconciliation efforts, the 6 families who participated in hosting the Japanese women passed down stories of those encounters to their children and grandchildren. These stories became family lore, shared at reunions and recorded in family histories. They contributed to a broader understanding within these families that national conflicts, however justified, involved real human beings on all sides, and that peace required actively choosing to see beyond political abstractions to individual humanity. By the early 21st century, several of the Japanese women's descendants made contact with descendants of the Texas families, facilitated by internet communications that would have seemed like science fiction in 1946. These connections led to exchanges of family histories, photographs, and artifacts. In 2008, a delegation of Japanese visitors traveled to Texas, including a granddaughter of Kimiko Yamamoto, to visit the Hutchins Ranch and see where her grandmother had experienced unexpected kindness during the darkest period of her life. The broader historical significance of these events lies not in grand policy changes or major diplomatic breakthroughs but in the testimony they provide about the possibility of human connection even amid hatred and violence. The encounter between Texas cowboys and Japanese POWs in March of 1946 represented something larger than the individuals involved. It demonstrated that reconciliation begins not with treaties signed by politicians but with ordinary people choosing to act with decency when they could easily choose otherwise. Historical records preserved at the Texas State Historical Association document that the ranch visit program, while officially ending with the closure of the Crystal City facility in late 1946, had lasting impacts on how some Texas communities approached international relations and cultural exchange. Several of the families involved became active in hosting foreign exchange students in subsequent decades, viewing this work as a continuation of the spirit that had motivated their participation in the original program. The Rodriguez family, in particular, became known throughout South Texas for their involvement in cultural bridge-building initiatives. Michiko Hayashi, the artist who had sketched scenes from the ranch visits, returned to Japan and eventually established herself as a respected painter whose work explored themes of war, memory, and reconciliation. In 1973, she mounted an exhibition in Tokyo titled Texas Sky, which featured paintings and drawings from her time at the Crystal City facility and the ranch visits. The exhibition catalog included extensive notes explaining the context of these works, introducing many Japanese viewers to a dimension of the American wartime experience they had never encountered, Americans who chose kindness over revenge. Several of Michiko's paintings from this exhibition were later acquired by the National Museum of American History in Washington, where they remain part of the permanent collection documenting the complex aftermath of World War II. Art historians have noted that her work provides a counter-narrative to the dominant stories of either American triumphalism or Japanese victimization, instead presenting a more nuanced account of how individuals navigated the space between these extremes. Yuriko Sato, the literature student, completed her university education after returning to Japan and became a translator specializing in American literature. Her translations of Western novels and poetry introduced Japanese readers to American literary voices and contributed to the cultural exchange that characterized the post-war era. In interviews late in her life, she credited her time at the Hutchins Ranch with giving her a more complex understanding of American culture, one that recognized regional variations, class differences, and the gap between government policy and individual behavior. Fumiko Ishikawa, the physician, faced significant obstacles to resuming her medical practice in post-war Japan due to both gender discrimination and the stigma attached to former POWs. However, she persevered and eventually established a clinic serving rural communities outside Hiroshima. Her experiences during the war, including the medical care she provided in captivity and the unexpected respect she received from American military personnel at Crystal City, shaped her approach to medicine as fundamentally about human dignity. She trained numerous younger physicians, emphasizing the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings rather than simply collections of symptoms. The military personnel involved in the ranch visit program also carried forward the lessons learned during that period. Lieutenant Robert Morrison returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania, where he taught history at a local high school. His lectures on World War II always included discussion of the ranch visits, using them as a case study in the complexity of war and the necessity of maintaining humanity even toward enemies. Several of his students later reported that these discussions fundamentally shaped their understanding of international relations and moral responsibility. Corporal David Chen, the Chinese-American translator who had facilitated so many of the conversations between the Texas families and the Japanese women, pursued a career in international development after his military service. He worked for various United Nations agencies throughout Asia, and his experiences at Crystal City informed his approach to reconciliation work in post-conflict societies. In retirement, he wrote a memoir titled Between Worlds that devoted several chapters to the Texas ranch visits, describing them as formative experiences that taught him about the power of simple human connection to transcend political divisions. Colonel James Henderson, who had approved the ranch visit program despite potential controversy, continued his military career and rose to the rank of general. He later served in administrative roles during the Korean War and was known among his colleagues for his emphasis on winning hearts and minds rather than simply achieving military objectives. In classified reports that have since been declassified, he repeatedly referenced the Crystal City program as evidence that American values could serve as diplomatic assets if applied consistently and sincerely. The ranches themselves continued operating through subsequent generations, adapting to changes in the cattle industry and the broader economy. The Hutchins Ranch remained in family hands through Sam and Margaret's grandchildren, who maintained the property much as their grandparents had, though with modern equipment and techniques. A small display case in the ranch house preserves artifacts from the 1946 visits, photographs, Michiko's sketches, the origami crane, and copies of letters exchanged between the families and the Japanese women. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Chung, granddaughter of Corporal David Chun, produced a film titled Crossroads, When Cowboys Met POWs, that brought renewed attention to these events. The documentary included interviews with descendants of both the Texas families and the Japanese women, archival footage and photographs, and expert commentary from historians specializing in World War II and its aftermath. The film premiered at the South by Southwest Festival in Austin and was later broadcast on public television, introducing a new generation to this remarkable story. The documentary prompted additional research into similar reconciliation efforts that occurred in the immediate post-war period, many of which had been forgotten or underreported. Historians discovered numerous instances of American families extending kindness to former enemies, Japanese individuals reaching out to their former captors, and grassroots efforts to build understanding across the chasm created by war. These stories collectively challenged simplified narratives of the period and revealed the complexity of how nations and individuals actually process the trauma of conflict. Educational programs developed in response to the documentary's success now use the ranch visits as teaching material in courses on conflict resolution, international relations, and American history. Students analyzed the factors that enabled such encounters to occur. The geographic isolation that perhaps made the Texas families less immediately threatened by Japanese prisoners. The cowboy culture's emphasis on hospitality and fair dealing. The war weariness that made many Americans ready for reconciliation. And the simple human capacity for empathy when confronted with individual suffering rather than abstract enemies. The town of Crystal City, Texas, which had been reluctant for decades to acknowledge its role in housing a POW processing facility, eventually embraced this history as part of its identity. In 2018, the town installed a historical marker at the site of the former facility, with text acknowledging both the difficult circumstances of the prisoners' confinement and the unprecedented reconciliation program that emerged from the community. The dedication ceremony included speakers from Japan and descendants of both the prisoners and the local families who had hosted them. Perhaps most significantly, the story of the ranch visits has been incorporated into educational curricula in both Japan and the United States as an example of how ordinary individuals can contribute to peacebuilding even in the aftermath of devastating conflict. Students in both countries study the events as a counterpoint to the dominant narratives of either nation, learning that history is not simply a story of governments and policies but also of individual choices that accumulate into broader social change. The origami crane that Kimiko Yamamoto gave to Sam Hutchins in March of 1946 still rests on the mantelpiece at the ranch house, now protected by a small glass case. It has faded over the decades, the paper yellowed and fragile, but it endures as a tangible reminder of an encounter that transcended hatred. The crane represents not just one woman's gratitude but a broader truth about human nature, that even in the darkest circumstances, people retain the capacity to choose kindness, to see beyond categories of enemy and friend, to recognize shared humanity. The women who sat on those horses on a dusty Texas crossroad in the spring of 1946 have all passed away now, as have the cowboys who offered them that unexpected kindness. But their story persists, carried forward by descendants, documented by historians, taught in classrooms, and preserved in archives. It persists because it offers something people need to believe, that reconciliation is possible, that enemies can become something more complex than enemies, and that peace is built not just through grand gestures but through countless small acts of recognition and respect. The final word perhaps belongs to Kimiko Yamamoto herself, who, in a letter to Elizabeth Hutchins written in 1962, reflected on that afternoon. "I have lived many years since that day when I first sat upon a horse in Texas. I have seen my country rebuilt, have taught hundreds of students, have experienced both joy and sorrow, but I have never forgotten the feeling of that moment when a stranger showed me kindness when he could have shown contempt. It taught me that the human heart is larger than national boundaries, and that lesson has guided me through all the years since. I pray that others may learn this lesson without enduring the suffering that taught it to me." That prayer echoes across the decades, a reminder of both the cost of war and the possibilities of peace. Written in the lives of women who survived unimaginable hardship and cowboys who chose compassion over contempt, preserved in faded photographs and yellowed paper cranes, and passed down through generations as a testament to humanity's capacity for redemption even in the darkest hours.